Hey everyone, I'm Barb Kipreos. I'm the co-chair for the CLSN's JEDI Roundtable. That's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I also work as the engagement officer for the San Mateo Resource Conservation District. Um, and just a little bit about the CLSN. It's a network that connects like more than 30 like regional collaboratives and a lot of partnerships. And I think it covers 40% of California's lands and waters. So yeah, instead of focusing on a single place or project, the CLSN helps work across like boundaries, like geographic, institutional, cultural. And it's the goal is to tackle shared challenges, to find shared solutions. Um, and yeah, so the network is grounded in like relationships and common values and a commitment to caring for people and the land. And within the network, we have a Jedi Roundtable for healing separate connections, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. I know it's a long name, bear with. And we develop tools and approaches and conversations that help us accomplish better conservation. And so the Equity Leader Speaker Series, which is why you're here, brings those values to life. And we highlight how we can center justice and belonging and all we can do through these conversations. And that's why we're here today, talking about mutual aid. So we're joined by four panelists who are advancing mutual aid strategies in their work to address like pressing issues, especially with climate change. And so later on, I don't think you can see them now, but trust and believe they're there. We have Kellex Nelson, the executive director of the San Mateo RCD and the CLSN steering committee member. We have Chairman Valentin Lopez, chair of the Alamotz and Tribal Band. Nina Raj, founder of the Altadena Seed Library in Los Angeles. And Claire Robinson, the executive director at Amigos de los Rios. And if you've heard of like Emerald Necklace stuff in LA, they work on that stuff. And so we brought them here because each of them brings a different perspective on what it means to care for each other and for the land in overlapping crises. But before we jump into their stories, we want to take a moment to talk about what we mean by mutual aid and how it relates to collaborative conservation. And so mutual aid first emerged as like from like frontline communities like queer, Black, Native, immigrant, and low income communities who learn the hard way and understand that when systems fail, their survival depends on each other. Examples of mutual aid, like everyday ones, are like when neighbors check on each other during a storm, or when people drop off like groceries for someone who can't physically do that themselves. Overall, it's like an instinct to show up for each other and meet each other's needs, especially if the current systems and institutions, when I say that, I mean like government organizations, like the structural support that we think, hopefully think firstly go to for help if they aren't meeting needs. So it's grounded in a few different principles. Some of them are solidarity, not charity. So it's like not about showing up to rescue people, but because we're in this together. Interdependence. The whole thing is about mutual survival. That's where the mutual comes from. And autonomy. We don't decide for others what they deserve or like, what they should do with the resources that we give them, we share with them. And responsiveness. And so seeing like a need and stepping in and not waiting for like the perfect conditions or institutional approval often. And then relationships and commitment. So like mutual aid isn't like a transaction or a quick fix. It's a long term like practice that involves like trust and relationships. And so often mutual aid arises from crisis when there's no like top-down fix or emergency plan, and instead neighbors and friends come together to do what they need to meet each other's needs, and that's a lot of needs. And so I think in this room with a lot of like collaborative conservationists, that story might feel really familiar. Um, a lot of the partnerships and networks that we formed began after fire or flood or just the realization that the current systems alone aren't sufficient in and of themselves to meet all of our needs, and we have to help each other. And beyond just fixing something, it's about building something new together. And with that being said, to frame the conversation today, I'd like to ask Devin, who's the coordinator for the CLSN and who has supported like landscape scale collaboration for years, about what parallels are you seeing between mutual aid and collaborative conservation?
Yeah, thanks so much, Barb. And thanks to the JEDI Roundtable for Healing's Ever Connections to host the start of a new equity leader speaker series. Um, I'm really glad we're starting with this topic and with this question. I think it's such a compelling example of how we continue to imagine the landscape stewardship movement, um, and really think about how it's part of a broader constellation, right, of activity happening across California that's about shifting paradigms around power and how decisions get made and how people feel more connected to each other. So you've already named one of the big parallels that I'm always thinking about and worth emphasizing, that these mutual aid networks and conservation collaboratives do often emerge from some acute or ongoing crisis that calls those people together and requires them to work together toward better outcomes. And when I think about my own history in the field, um, it's striking that I was first drawn to collaborative conservation because it offered this pathway for addressing really big crises in natural resources and conservation across the American West. And at first, I was really drawn to the conflicts that rose up around them. So whether it was human and wildlife conflict or recreation conflicts, fire, like you named, whatever it is acting on the land, I was really interested in the way that people reacted to it. And there was always crisis kind of overlapping that. And you mentioned overlapping crises just now. And interestingly, this morning in my inbox was an essay from the Black Feminist Fund, who wrote to the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and they were describing this moment as polycrisis, which they defined as a reality where multiple interrelated crises combine to create compounded, outsized effects, and it is a term that they're using widely to describe this moment. And I thought that was really really apt as we continue to really see how ecological and social crises intersect all the time as we experience climate change. And, I think is part of the story about why we see mutual aid networks and collaborative conservation networks blossoming, really everywhere over recent years. So, really that conflict and crisis was what drew me to the field initially. But what I realized quickly was that the history was about participatory democracy, really. It was about the power of a collective. And I realized that it was less about crisis and conflict per se and more about the way that systems and institutions cause people to feel powerless, or they cause them to feel like they're unheard as they try to address these crises. And that's where so many of our place-based collaboratives that we engage with in California have created really meaningful spaces for folks who just want to make a difference for their landscapes and their communities. So, beyond that, I also, I see that fundamental parallel between mutual aid networks and landscape scale stewardship, both in this state and across the country. And, when we think about the principles and values that really underlie these networks, so many of them are built on those similar values of trust and reciprocity, the idea that everyone has knowledge and skills to offer, and many other points in common. And I think what I'd want to emphasize here also, and we've talked about at the JEDI Roundtable, is that none of this is meant to suggest that mutual aid networks and stewardship and conservation networks are interchangeable. And that's not the purpose of this webinar. Um, but I do find it helpful to see how these principles and values that underpin mutual aid approaches and collaborative conservation approaches not only overlap, but they're growing out of similar contexts. And so what's most exciting to me and why I'm excited to invite our colleagues over the next hour to tell their stories is that this sort of connection of ideas really helps me to expand my understanding, how I imagine collaborative stewardship, ultimately as a way to empower people and to provide a measure of autonomy and connection that can be pretty hard to find in today's day and age.
Mm, that's cool. Yeah, and I'll add to that the part you said about like institutions and stuff, that the goal here isn't necessarily to do mutual aid as institutions. It I think by definition can't do mutual aid. It's between individuals. So I wanted to highlight that. And then, yeah, I really like the way you talked about these networks as places where autonomy and connection coexist. And because that's at the heart of mutual aid. it's like finding ways to support each other that strengthens the other person's power, rather than like taking it. And when there's power imbalances between partners, knowing that the mutual part of mutual aid is about equal, mutual survival and not necessarily equal exchange. That being said, reminds me of the next panelist, Kelix and Chairman Lopez. I'll wait for them to go on screen. But yeah, excited to talk to y'all today. Uh, so y'all's relationship has been built through time and trust and showing up for each other, especially when that's been really hard. And I've heard in the past you both talk about how partnerships with tribes need to know when to like step back and not fall in the trap of like helping while also exerting control. Could y'all talk about how you learned how to navigate the like the asymmetries that come with having different types of power, but having that deep trust and relationship?
I want to, just mentioned the word trust, and I want to talk about that. The hardest thing for a tribe in forming relationships is trust. Um, After you consider our history and 200 years of just being exploited, abused, um, and on and on, how could we be expected to trust others from outside the tribal communities? And so that has always been the biggest challenge for us. We move slow. We tell our partners that we need to move at the pace of the tribe. We tell them that they get one chance, and we are serious about that. If we just see one incident where we feel that there was disrespect or not follow through, or they try to use the tribe in any way, we walk away, and we don't have a problem doing that. So we built trust slowly over time, um, with the San Mateo RCD. And the other thing is working with CalX. CalX had a strong um, commitment to humanity and helping others and understanding the impacts of historic trauma and stuff. So those knowing the person is probably the most important thing, and trusting them. I'll pass it on to Alex to add to that if she'd like.
Um, yeah, thanks, Val. I'd say that well, first of all, I think it's one of the things that for people who aren't familiar with RCDs, we help people help the land. And so because our conservation approach is grounded in helping people, it's really natural for us to be able to do what you're saying, Val. Um, and Barb, you were sort of asking about, the question was kind of like the potential inequity and the power, right? And so a lot of our relationship has been about San Mateo RCD helping the Amamutsin tribe via their land trust to have capacity to be able to do land stewardship. And so that means we've helped navigate permitting when they didn't have the capacity or technical knowledge to be able to do that yet. And also, as we're an entity of the state and could enter into like an interagency agreement with state parks to be able to pay the tribal members to do work on state parks property, or we could write them into grants and doing grants administration. And during the time, I don't know how many years it's been now. I feel like it's maybe a decade that we've been working with the tribe. Their capacity has fluctuated. After a couple hundred years of trauma, you can't expect someone to just like pop up and have steady capacity. So we've really had to, um, be ready to fill those gaps, whether it's cash flow or technical assistance, but always understanding that we're working under the direction of the tribe, always, and that our goal ultimately is to not be relevant anymore, right? Is to step away. And one of the things that Chairman Lopez communicated really clearly to us very early on was that it's embarrassing for the tribe when people expect them to know things, some knowledge that they'd been, they've been cut off from for a while and they were relearning. And that what they expected and needed from us was to be patient during that process of relearning and to be ready to defer to that. And I appreciated, Val, that you were always really clear on the fact that, what your role was and what our role was. And I think we were clear on that as well. I have seen times where the organizations who are allies to tribes and others build almost too much of their identity around that role and don't know like when to step away. And I'd say one thing to make sure of for those groups is to make sure that your business model isn't dependent on helping another group. Like that isn't a primary source of revenue for your organization so that you don't have any conflicts of interest, and making sure that at some point the capacity or the funding or whatever can go straight to the tribe or other group that you're working with, and you don't have to be a middle person anymore. Did that answer your question at all, Barb?
Yeah, I think so. Chairman, do you have anything to add to that about like the especially the power element?
Well, Calix did say that, the tribe working with, under the tribe. That's the other thing that I say usually at the initial meeting, is that our tribe must have yes, no decision-making authority on everything related to tribal culture. And when you're working with the state of California or national parks or Bureau of Land Management, et cetera, a lot of times they don't want to give away that authority, but we won't work with them otherwise. And we're not coming to this effort here with empty pockets. We bring knowledge, traditional knowledge that we have forgotten, but that we are working hard to restore, of how to take care of these lands so that they can, once again, like in the central coast of California, the greater Monterey Bay, that was the most, or one of the most biodiverse landscapes in North America. And it was our ancestors who developed that landscape. So we recognize that we have these kinds of knowledges to offer. So that's what I mean when they say we're not coming with empty pockets. Our traditional ways of burning, our traditional ways of monitoring plants, of ensuring that the land maintains its sacredness. Those are all qualities and knowledge that we are working to restore and bring it back to for our benefit, but also the benefit of everyone else.
I think that one of the really significant spaces where we've encountered power and an uneven power dynamic, I wonder, Chairman Lopez, if you would agree with this, is unintended maybe, but in how permitting and funding is structured. So this is more systemic. So for example, state funding, grant funding, bond related funds that we were able to secure to help the tribe with vegetation management and stewardship at a certain site. It is boilerplate language in these agreements that that the funder can at any time come out and observe the project, and that's intended to be to ensure accountability in how funds are spent, taxpayer dollars. But it's not always right fitting when for a tribal member, vegetation management might be prayer, and they don't want someone to come watch them pray. And so these are some of the kinds of things that we had to navigate. Or for example, a couple millennia of vegetation management of growing and stewarding plants for food, fiber, medicine, ceremony doesn't necessarily fit like the local definition of agriculture that's in our local statute. And so if the tribe is working on land that's zoned agriculture, but thousands of years of their agricultural practice doesn't meet maybe the county's decades-old definition of agriculture, and they have to get a permit to do that work that they did for millennia, there creates all these like power imbalances. And so one of the things that we tried to do was to use our position and our knowledge and our access to correct some of those imbalances, so that Amundsen had funding and regulatory approvals that were right fitting for the tribe.
I love
I
that.
want to,
Yeah.
I'd like to add just a little bit to that. We were working to restore um, a very important first contact site um, just north, very near Pescadero, and and it was zoned agriculture. And we wanted to restore our traditional native plants, but our traditional native plants did not fit the definition of agriculture. And we don't like to use that term agriculture. Agriculture means that you domesticate and dominate plants and or animals, and we don't do that. But you know, we worked. CalX and the tribe and state parks actually worked with us to get the county to change its definition of agriculture to allow Native American, traditional Native American uh, food plants, medicine plants, basket tree plants, etc., to um, um, to be recognized as agriculture. I'll stop there. Thank you. That was very important for us, and we've used that in other counties now too.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and something you were talking earlier about traditional ecological knowledge and how much we'll need that going forward. I did want to highlight that, yeah, like the way that we see mutual aid as mutual survival, that is necessary for survival. And so that's cool parallel. And then also something about what you were saying was reminding me of what Devin was saying about the need for autonomy and connection coexisting. And also that I feel like true connection can't exist unless you have that autonomy. And so I think that y'all's relationship or like the making sure you don't lose trust, you need to respect autonomy. And I think that's cool. Um, so yeah. So next, we're going to transition to Nina Raj. Um, yeah, mutual aid isn't always easy to, practice of like navigating difference while staying in relationship with each other. And that same practice, I think, shows up in everyday choices too, and like how we choose to share, how we trust people to know what they need and to use what they need according to whatever values they have, even if it's different from what we would choose. And it's sometimes hard to let go of that control. But yeah. See, let me make sure Nina's on the screen. There you are. Nina, I wanted to ask if you would first mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what the Altatina Seed Library does.
Yeah, totally happy to. And thanks for having me. My name is Nina, and I run Altadena Seed Library. We're a network of little free seed libraries. They're just like the little free book libraries, but for seeds. So we have outposts all across Los Angeles County and also Temecula, up in Sonoma, over in New York. We've kind of got them spreading all over, which is really exciting. And we do seed education and distribution, mostly around native plants. And then we also do conservation seed bank training, as well as some like phytoremediator training and other bioremediation work.
Cool. Yeah, huge fan of your work, by the way. But yeah, you've mentioned in past conversations that sometimes people come to you with worries of like, okay, people are contributing to like a community seed bank. What if someone like takes all of the seeds? How do you prevent that? Or like, shouldn't you make sure that they're planting like natives instead of non-natives? How do you like make sure that they're planting like the right things? Can you talk about your answer to that and the values that are guiding you when you think about how to respond to that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the short answer is I don't. I don't. I have no interest in controlling any of that. I think, um, I'm loving hearing all these examples of mutual aid in this conversation so far, and I'm just reminded of how mutual aid is an opportunity to support one another directly when our systems fail us. And when I think about what that's rooted in, one, it's rooted not only in, supporting human neighbors, but also non-human neighbors and the land and this deep practice of listening. Um, and really autonomy. So communities getting to decide for themselves what they need. So every single seed library is going to be different. And we say that we're trying to support issues like shade equity and food sovereignty. We have a lot of lack of access to shade and access to green space and fresh produce. And so kind of enabling communities to have the tools that they need to grow that shade themselves, to grow that food themselves. But each neighborhood is going to be distinct. So what a community garden in Glendale might need might be totally different from like what the Boyle Heights Library might need, and they might have different plants that they want to put in their seed library or share with their neighbors. They might have different educational needs. So when I think about trying to control like what people put in, I sort of think of it like the kind of comparison I've drawn before is like I wouldn't tell somebody like what kind of genre of book to put in a little free book library. So I think it's just reflecting the distinct needs of each community. But all of the educational resources that I put out are about native plants, just to kind of support our local ecosystem here, in terms of the land and also the pollinators. And when you asked about people taking too many seeds, I have no issue with that. I think another kind of important pillar is trust. And my hope is that if somebody takes all the seeds, they needed all those seeds, or maybe they're going to share them, or maybe they're just going to use them all. And that's great. And maybe they'll think about that process of, reciprocity and putting something back in there. But maybe they don't have capacity to do that. And, I try not to hold it too tightly.
Yeah, I've looked into a lot of seed libraries because they're so cool. But I think a lot of them have like they want accountability between like members, and in doing so, I think sometimes it can end up being prescriptive or a little bit of bureaucracy of like signing up and like making sure that you're saying these are the seeds I've taken and these one of the that type of thing. I guess how has that worked out? Have you seen like within communities? Um, just taking what
Yeah,
you
totally. I mean, I think any form of seed sharing is amazing. So I'm not trying to like, you know, uh, reflect any kind of opinion one way or another about process. But with the seed libraries that we put out, there's no barriers to access. So nobody has to sign their name. We don't need your information. We don't need to like track seed packets. And sometimes that's for a few reasons, but one is just a sensitivity to tracking or, that accountability, having your name down. Another is also time, like having to take the time to track a packet. Not everyone has that time, or wants to spend that time. So, or feeling this like sense of duty to maybe like return seeds or something, when again, maybe not everyone has capacity to return seeds. And I think it can kind of go back to that reflection of trust or lack thereof.
Yeah, and it's reminding me of one of those like sayings they say in like mutual aid of like uh give what you can, take what you need type things. It's and the whole thing about also the mutual part not being like exactly equal exchange.
Mhm.
That it's okay sometimes if like someone is not putting back the resources that they're taking out. You know what I mean?
Totally.
It's reminding me a little bit of Robin Wall Kimmerer's gift economy type thing of like, if enough people do this, then we'll all have our needs met. And so the person who you're helping might not be the one that helps you in your time of need, but like as a culture, we're like, taking care of each other. Pretty
Yeah, absolutely. I have a deep belief that it will balance out. So, yeah.
love that.
Mhm.
And then there's something else you said when I was talking to you before that was really interesting about mutual aid is not only about human relationships and partnerships, but also as a lens of restoration. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can, as humans, really like all do a better job of listening to our non-human neighbors and supporting them and thinking about like our kind of role or our place in the system rather than a top-down system where we are kind of controlling what anyone needs. So I would say I'm no restoration expert at all, but that process of like pausing to listen and reflect and let the earth speak for itself, I think is especially important right now in the wake of the Eaton fire. It's just taking that time when it's really tempting to want to like jump into action and go do something or try to like uh, start helping. And I think it comes from a really good impulse, but or well-intentioned impulse, I should say. But yeah, giving the earth time to heal and then figuring out what might be needed, I think is maybe a better practice right now.
I vibe with that. And it's reminding me of our next panelist, and hopefully we can have y'all kind of touch base on like the parallels between your experiences next. But yeah, thank you. I really like the story about how your story shows like the small ways of how we think about our relationships with each other and how transformative it can be. And yeah. And so it's reminding me of our next panelist because when crisis strikes, that type of care, I think, is what helps us rebuild. And so, Claire, welcome. We've talked before about how in the aftermath of the LA fires, you mentioned something about it showed you who was really in community with you. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and then also what that time revealed to you about what you value in partnerships?
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name is Claire Robinson, and this is our 21st year working in natural infrastructure in East County. And right after the fires, we had a lot of amazing folks who we knew about, other nonprofits in the region, essentially working on the same mission as ours, landscape scale conservation, but in individual neighborhoods. And I think based on one of our collaborators, the Conservation Fund, posted something on Instagram for us saying that we had lost everything. Our office burned down the night of the fire and some of our homes, staff homes, and kind of like the mycelium network that JEDI, the California Landscape Stewardship Network, has been focused on. It was almost like instantly we had offers to regroup at local engineering firms that we had been partnering with on natural infrastructure, or the Audubon Debs Park, the Friends of the LA River, Sierra Club. We ended up at the Western Center for Justice. But people automatically just provided us with a space, and it was very touching. And then it was also like the critical mass. We needed new operational tools, new computers, because kind of like we're doing this work with nature, but we're really dependent on technology. And so people made sure we got new laptops and protective equipment for our staff to be out in the field, because the fires were still going and a lot of problems with toxins and things like that. And also support with just regrouping on the tools that were lost, basic office furniture, making sure that we could raise funds to buy air filters for each and every one of our staff members, which was really like, I think I was in a daze at the time, but it was really, really incredible, to have that support. And then we started hearing from local researchers and scientists, like within hours of the fire. The Angeles National Forest, Francisco Escobedo did a rapid assessment, like while the ashes were still smoldering in Altadena, and shared that he was there and that he would share his research, not officially, but unofficially. And there were researchers from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and the California Cooperative Extension. And I'm looking to models in Europe where, like in Sweden, where the universities and the government and the private sector and community genuinely optimize working together, because that's such a source of melancholy that I do not feel, even though we worked in Altadena for 22 years, like our headquarters were there and a lot of our staff live there, I do not feel any kind of reciprocal communication with the county. Like the failure of systems to protect us in West Altadena, with respect to emergency management, we were never notified that our homes and offices were in a zone that meant we should get ready to leave. We should take precautions. And, we live with fires in California, so we've had multiple fires, but the maps were wrong that night. And we didn't know to get ready to leave, and we didn't leave. And our office burned down before it was even in a map zone that indicated danger. So subsequent to the fire, I think dealing with the disappointment or the free fall, I think many cultures, as Val had mentioned, have lived with this, constantly. Like, if you can't trust government, if there's nobody there to pick up a 911 call and take a disabled person out of the neighborhood so they don't burn, it's hard to take seriously the departments, the county departments, Public Works or Parks and Rec or whatever the different departments are subsequently. So what I found fascinating is that experts have emerged in response, for example, to a lot of different items like food security and clothing and places to be safe, in living until we find rehousing for folks. But also people have come forward to help with the trees, because Altadena was known, we had a lot of inequity, like we had from 0 canopy to 49% canopy. So even that's really high, like the 49% is really high in the county, but we needed that because as a foothill community, it's extremely hot there, like crazy hot. And the heat island is really impacting student health and folks who are more vulnerable, everybody's quality of life. So as a nonprofit doing urban greening, we went from trying to define a new materials science for working at schools to remove asphalt and add 40 to 50% tree canopy and nature-based play and complexity, variety of spaces for students who are diverse in their ways of learning and physicality, to dealing with a catastrophe, where we didn't, like, I don't have a house left, we don't have an office. And it's all about people just helping us when we're in this moment of wanting to keep working, but being a bit in free fall. So that was very interesting who checked in on us. Like, we had calls from all the different state departments, like CAL FIRE called and came down within 48 hours to walk with us and see what trees that they had paid for are still alive in Altadena, how the school projects we did were doing, they were there immediately. We had calls from the Natural Resources Agency to say, this is a wellness check, how are you, your organization, how are your staff, is everybody okay, mental health wise, physically. Whereas we did not have calls from any county departments. No one checked in on us. And like, I don't know how to explain it, but like when you live your whole life or a couple decades in a place and you invest everything in it, like of your professional know-how and your excitement about just the joy of being a parent, it's really interesting, to see when there is a crisis, who's there.
Yeah. And I'd like to, acknowledge something you said about, like, because it is worldview shifting, I think. And it's I think sometimes quite traumatic if, like, you think you can trust a system and then there's a moment in time where you realize, oh, it in and of itself alone is not enough. And so, yeah, you mentioned something else that we were talking about, that I want to touch on real quick before we move on to like the full panel discussion about you had this realization that we're all working on the same project because everyone's
Right.
working together to build the same vision. Could you touch on that before we head on to the next?
Yeah, that's the exciting part. And you know, Nina is from our same community, so it's really nice to meet her and hear about Val's work with you know, controlled burn. And so our biggest issue is climate change. You know, our organization was formed to be proactive and raise our literacy. And in that sense, all of the different groups across Los Angeles County who are doing anything with resource conservation or environmental justice, social justice, I think we're all working on the same project. So the complete destruction of Altadena, social fabric, environmental, you know, biodiversity is an opportunity to really look at coming together in a better way. Like, we didn't have tree canopy equity, so let's make sure we protect existing trees. And there are dark actors in the zone, you know, pushing people to take down beautiful 60-inch diameter oaks that aren't really in danger for insurance reasons. Like, we're stepping in with arborists and experts and the Arbor Day Foundation and other funders to take trees that have been genuinely lost and mill them so we have meaningful, locally produced materials, and we can prototype an affordable housing that is locally produced and conserves the affordability for neighbors, but also integrates the biodiversity and integrates stormwater capture and green streets and things that weren't perfect about Altadena before. So that's the hope, that we can try to envision something better than we had. But I do think that what's really been amazing is seeing how tied we are. Like, because I hadn't been in touch with these other executive directors and stuff, but people just completely, it was like we blinked an eye and we were back up and running within almost like days.
That's a wonderful experience, at least like the seeing the people coming together afterwards. And it's reminding me of us coming back together after our individual panel discussions. Um, yeah, we're going to be bringing all of our panelists back on in a moment. And so, yeah, this is like a good time, I think, for those connection points of like things that were coming up as you were hearing other people's stories about what's resonating, maybe what's different. Um, Stuff like that. Did anyone have any like thoughts that came up that they wanted to share?
Something that came up for me is, Claire, when you talked about, I mean, I can feel the grief that you're carrying right now. And yet in this moment, you were able to see, like, you know, where there's cracks, light comes through, and that, and this was an unusual opportunity to see how people can show up. And how, you know, a crisis can help us see how people can show up for each other. I was also wondering, if that is creating any new power dynamics for you in which you're more vulnerable in those because these groups helped you. So, you know, if I was wondering if, in the future you would feel you could take a stand against them or disagree or make a demand or have an expectation after they helped.
Well, in the measure that, like, the folks who've helped, we didn't really work with them before. We just admired each other from afar, kind of thing. It's really about this wonderful, bigger landscape scale conservation vision. Like, we know, you know, you're working in a particular county and doing everything you can every minute to collaborate with Val and others to do the best you can. And yet your vision is for the whole state, right? You want everybody to have this ditto, us in Altadena and our vision for the county. So I don't really see problems with that. Where I see we could have really big problems is taking a stand against the county, because we've, like, for example, just on a really practical level, our remaining trees are going to die this summer the mature trees that have been damaged unless we water. And so we need a couple hundred people to do a watering brigade, and we're going to do it with or without permission. Because we've done the right thing. We've emailed, 20 times and said, can you guarantee that you're going to be watering the street trees, the 2,000 trees? They're like, oh no, we'll get back to you. We have a committee. It'll take a few weeks. It's been 3, now it's been 6. We don't know. So, that could, for our nonprofit, we're going to step in and just do things that we have to do, that to protect what's left in our area. And I don't know how that's going to work. But we can't wait for permission any longer.
Yeah, that's really rough when like there's a need that must be met. You can meet it, but to do so would maybe jeopardize a relationship or like I think there's times when like you can go through a system and everything's good, and then sometimes when something just needs to get done. And that's really unfortunate, I think, that it might cause negative stuff happen in your relationships. But yeah, is that conjuring up any other thoughts of people and how they've seen power dynamics in relationships, especially if someone's given a bunch of resources to someone? It's like that thing of mutual aid is not charity type thing because it takes into account the power dynamics a little bit better. Y'all, 5 seconds of silence is all I can do so that gets said. I'm not playing.
I'm wondering, Barb, if any of the attendees had any questions about any of the things that any of us spoke about, and if so, just a reminder to folks to put it in the Q&A.
True. Yeah. And we have Amanda, I think, looking at the Q&A. Amanda, if there's anything good, let me know. Otherwise, I did prepare a backup question because of my fear of silence. So basically, something I wanted to ask y'all is that when everything feels really uncertain and it's really tempting to go into self-preservation mode, and then you have mutual aid that's like based on the idea that we survive by showing up for each other. I guess, has there ever been a time where like someone took a risk to support others, you know, or like have you ever decided between protecting your own organization or showing up for someone else? What helped you choose to show up for them, or what did you learn by not showing up for them if you really regretted that?
I feel like that's all the time for our RCD. I'm having a hard time thinking. I'm seeing a lot of nodding. I mean, I think that's maybe part of the reason that we're here is because we're individuals and organizations that do that. And I think that one of the things that we see about collaborative stewardship and landscape scale stewardship is complex reciprocity, moving past things that are transactional. I often do see groups thinking that they are creating a partnership or a collaboration if they create an MOU or have some sort of contract. Um, and I think that, the relationship comes first and those agreements tend to follow. But if you start with those agreements, they don't work. And that once you have those agreements in place, as valuable as they are, they can also make it so that you're defining your relationship that way, and it's hard to go outside of the agreements for what the moment calls for.
Yeah, I love that. And I would also just add that for me, it's just been a more of a reframing of not necessarily it being a dichotomy of like one or the other, or if someone else is brought up with, someone else to, I don't know, it has to be at the sacrifice of another. So really just like prioritizing the collective and supporting one another, and kind of rising tide raises all boats.
Yeah, and Allison posted in the chat. I would love to hear how folks preserve relationships while having to deviate from a process those you're in a relationship with have mutually agreed to in the past, but that no longer works in the moment and its time is sensitive.
Yeah, I have an example of that, Allison, that's very contemporaneous for us, which is that We partner with state parks and tribes and all of the resource agencies, state and federal, on habitat restoration. And there was, staff turnover in state parks, and a new archaeologist that came with their own relationships with the tribes and their own expectations for process. And here, we had ways of doing things. And, when it came to us doing a project that was with other partners, informed by the tribe, but on state parks property, we had expectations about how consultations would be done, how CEQA would be done. And it was like the project had already been delayed a year. And funding was going to run out and we needed to move now. And all of a sudden there were a lot of hurt feelings and things that weren't the way that we thought were the systems we had in place. We had to change them abruptly. And I think that there's going to be, and also like what we had put in the bank in our relationships were with other people in both the tribe and in state parks. And so that we didn't have that like shared history of trust. And so I think that we're going to be doing a lot of unpacking after this project is over and going back and rebuilding like where we borrowed money out of that or borrowed out of that account of trust. We're going to have to put some back in.
Yeah, it's reminding me of a kind of like the comparison of like when it's individuals in a community helping each other with like traditional mutual aid. The relationships are sometimes more straightforward because one person, but with an organization, often individuals hold that relationship and that trust and that institutional knowledge. And it's kind of like, yeah, it can be difficult. And Val, I remember earlier you said that you give partners like one chance, and if they like, really break that trust, that's it. I guess how do you navigate relationships and trusts with like organizations?
It's pretty much the same thing. When we first meet, I have kind of have a list of items that I want to go over with them to make sure that they understand our requirements for this relationship. And much to our surprise, that right there has only been violated one time where we had to cancel a $40,000 contract because the trust was broken. But people have come through in big ways that far exceeded our expectations. The RCD, for example, we were having trouble because we could not, when we bid on state contracts, we could not be the lowest bidder. While working with the San Mateo RCD, they were able to get the contracts and hire us as a subcontractor. That was a really creative way of doing it. And that was brought, and that was suggested by the RCD. So that right there helped us know that we can add those kinds of things. Another time that we had a job that we were working on, but we needed to have a biomonitor, and we didn't have a biomonitor within our land trust. And we talked to RCD about it, and they were able to send out an RCD to work with us so that we can complete that project. So the idea of building trust and then being able to call on those partners to help them is really big. And recently, we working with another partner, they needed help removing quite a few eucalyptus trees, and our crews were able to go out there and remove the eucalyptus trees. Based on the relationship we had, there was a lot of trust and a willingness on our part to do that work. So what we're talking about is what's going to make the whole system work and allow improvement for everyone. So this is an excellent and important topic.
For sure, for sure. Noticing we have about 5 minutes left. I guess I kind of wanted to ask people too, I guess, is there a dream that you have for how institutions can kind of show up differently in the context of all these values we've been talking about today, especially when it comes to power and especially with like the solidarity, not charity aspect is really sticking with me for some reason. But yeah, Would you all have any
Someone
dreams?
asked in the chat too, I guess it was Emma, what are some ways that state and local agencies can better serve mutual aid efforts? And I think for me, for us, and especially like processing this with, I'm obviously running the Amigos de los Rios, but I'm a parent with a child who lost her home, and trying to explain that in the world, there are going to be people who are really competent and enjoy being competent and take pride in developing competence in what they do. And there's people who are accountable. We all make mistakes, and it's really hard to admit it, but if you're doing your best and you make a mistake, you should be accountable and then empathetic. And if you see that you don't have 2 out of 3 or all 3 of those, then put up a force field. You got to protect. And so what would go a long way for us locally is just to be trusted. Like I think Alex mentioned, we're dealing with a lot of grief, and that's not unique to us in Altadena, but lots of people around the world are dealing with tremendous grief. But just to be trusted, we recently asked a park we had built, we wanted to go in and replant the understory that burned out with the same teenagers who had helped us do it, 5 years ago. And we were refused because we had to go through a permit process, and it was a control, and we didn't have the right to do that. It belonged to the county, blah, blah, blah. And it was so tone deaf, where it would have meant so much if someone said, you're trustworthy, we have your insurance, you run events every weekend, you've taken care of tens of thousands of people. We welcome you back to the park that you helped develop with community to replant it. And we want you to understand, we realize that's part of your grief and healing. If I had heard that, I would be in a whole different mind frame. Like, it's so simple just to have one person from government not hide behind the liability or the fear and just show up as a person.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's
Along those
sure.
lines, the way that we look at, using trees as an example, we see trees as relative. We, meaning our tribe and just about all tribes, see the trees as our relatives and stuff like that. So we have a responsibility to take care of our relatives and to help out. So changing the relationship and the understanding of the relationship with these important plants and stuff like that is an important component as well.
Yeah, and I imagine that that's even more difficult too when like you can't do like restoration on lands that that aren't yours. And so that must be pretty hard. We do have 1 minute left. Not to do a really hard transition. But yeah, so we've heard today about like mutual aid. It's not being about equal exchange, about mutual survival, to responding to crisis with care and sharing power. And yeah, we've seen a lot about like the deep partnerships people can build. And yeah, I think at its core, I think mutual aid is about caring for each other kind of radically, of seeing them as like uh your survival is intertwined with theirs. And I think it's really beautiful, the different types of interconnections that people have seen in their partnerships, or learned the hard way in some of them. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. And yeah, just as a reminder, let me see. Our next webinar is either late July or early August, and to join the CLSN newsletter for info on that. But yeah, thank you all so much. I think this is super important. I think to see the connection between the collaborative conservation that we do and mutual aid, I think is really powerful. So yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.